Okay, now we shall learn how to map the weak entities into the relational structure from the conceptual structure. Okay, so all the weak entities, obviously they become a separate relation. They have to become a separate relation because they are entities, and there is a foreign key that is taken from the superior entity. Superior entity is the entity which is a strong entity and that has an identifying relationship with the weak entity. That is referred to as the superior entity. So that superior entity's primary key, that is taken in the weak entity as a foreign key. Okay, this is one thing that is done. And also, because we do not have a permanent identifier in the weak entity, right? It's an indication for a weak entity, and it's a must for a weak entity. If there is an identifier given to the weak entity, then that weak entity would become a strong entity. So weak entity का अपना identifier कभी भी नहीं होगा, exist नहीं करेगा. So the partial identifier, weak entity has a partial identifier that is combined with the foreign key. Okay, as I told you, that the foreign key is taken from the superior relation. That foreign key is combined with the partial identifier of the weak entity, and that combination is then used as a primary key for that particular newly created relation. वो मल्टी वैल्यूड की एग्जांपल है. हम कोई और एग्जांपल देख लेते हैं. फॉर एग्जांपल वी हैव स्टूडेंट एंड डिपेंडेंट. ओके, एंड फॉर एग्जांपल डिपेंडेंट एंटिटी हैज a name and date of birth, let's suppose, and the partial identifier is name, for example. Okay, now while transforming, the student's ID would be added to the siblings table, and this student ID would refer to student ID of the student's relation. So this student ID would act as a foreign key. Okay, so for example, we have a student's entity and we have a siblings entity, and there is a relationship, and this relationship is an identifying relationship, and this sibling is a weak entity and this student is a superior entity. It's a strong and a superior entity in this particular identifying relationship. So for example, there are some attributes like name and date of birth. Okay, so we have got name and we have got date of birth, and for example, this name is the partial identifier. Okay, now while transforming, obviously we'll have a relation for this student's entity. Okay, for example, here is that relation, and SID, for example, is the primary key, and we have got name, and for example, we have got degree, for example. Let's assume. So one new relation would be created for sibling for this weak entity. Okay, and there would be a foreign key. Okay, SID. This foreign key would refer to the primary key of the superior relation, and the partial identifier plus this foreign key, they'll collectively act as identifier or the primary key for this newly created relation. So this would be the output while transforming the weak entity into the relational structure. Should I repeat it? So whenever there is a weak and a strong entity, we'll have two different relations, one for the strong while one for the weak entity. In the weak entity, there would be a foreign key taken from the superior relation. So that foreign key would be referencing to the primary key of the superior relation. In this new relation, the foreign key and the partial identifier of that weak entity, they'll collectively act as the composite primary key for this newly created relation. Okay, so it would mean that this entity, this relation represents a weak entity because the primary key, because the foreign key is used along with the partial identifier as primary key for this particular, as composite primary key for this particular relation. Okay, clear? So here is an example. So we had an employee entity and a dependent entity. Okay, and dependent was a weak entity, and there was an identifying relationship between the employee and the dependent. So the partial identifier was first, middle, and last name. So this employee ID has been added. Okay, and this has been added as a foreign key, and this is basically referencing the primary key of the superior relation. Number one. Number two, now this partial identifier and this foreign key, they'll act as composite primary key for this uh, newly created relation that represents the